Hey guys, welcome to another exciting lecture. Last time we discussed behavioral genetics and sort of got a better understanding for the genetic component of our behavioral characteristics. And today's lecture, we're going to examine how environmental influences can impact the phenotypic expression of your genetic components. So we're just kind of delving once again more into that discussion of the relationship between nature and nurture. So we're going to talk about a number of experiences that we have, and we're going to kind of start from the ground up and talk about the earliest experiences that we have, and sort of look at different things like how parents and peers can shape who you are, also how your culture and your gender can shape who you are, and the importance of how these impact your development from birth, actually from prenatal experience onwards. So we've looked at the genes, and now we're going to look at these experiences, and we're going to start with this prenatal environment. So experiences actually begin from the moment of conception. So once that sperm enters that egg, we then have that constant interplay between genes and environment. So we talked before about twin studies, and I mentioned before that identical twins regularly share a placenta. But interestingly, we find that actually about 33% of identical twins have their own placenta. So one of the things that we can use this to examine is if a third of identical twins share a placenta, don't share a placenta, and 2/3 do share a placenta, we can look at some differences in their personality characteristics and their behavioral traits, and also in many other physical traits, and sort of determine some more of that relationship between what percentage of any given trait is attributable to the environment or those genetic components. So what we find is that identical twins that share a placenta and therefore have a more similar, not 100% identical, but more similar prenatal environment are more similar when it comes to their psychological, behavioral, and physical traits. Now, I say that they're not identical, I say that they're more similar because they don't actually have the exact same experiences. So imagine, if you will, you're a woman pregnant with identical twins that are sharing a placenta. Well, one of those babies could have this cord right here wrapped around a vital component. That's an experience attributable to the environment that's beyond the control of the placenta. So it's not just the placenta that can impact that. So let's say this twin right here has a situation like my brother-in-law where the umbilical cord got wrapped around his neck. He's fine, didn't suffer any damage, but many children that when they're in the womb have the umbilical cord wrapped around some component suffer brain damage or other detriments to their health and well-being. So if we've got two identical twins that have that different experience, then obviously there's the possibility that more than just the placenta can impact that early prenatal environmental experience. So that's sort of all we're going to talk about prenatally. We do have these experiences early on within the placenta, and then also exposure to various chemicals that your mother might ingest while she's pregnant with you. And we call these toxic chemicals, things like introducing the fetus to alcohol. We call these what are known as teratogens. Teratogens often have very negative impacts on the development of a fetus because they're abnormal. The fetus is not prepared for exposure to such toxins, and it often has some pretty nasty side effects. So these are sort of what we get prenatally. But once we move out of the womb and we're born, we start very early on with these experiences that change and develop who we are. So the postnatal experiences very, very early on can impact our brain structure and how we learn later on. So way back in the first lecture, we talked about taking two identical twins and putting one of them in a wealthy household and one of them in an impoverished area. And we determined quite rightly that the individual in the better household was more likely to have a higher IQ. Well, this is part of why that is, because the children that are given access to that better environment have what's known as an enrichment experience. So when you have an infant, it's best to expose them to toys, regular touching, and I mean that as in interacting with them physically, holding them, touching areas on their body. My mom, when I was an infant, had this little baby book that had textures in it, and she would run my hands on different textures so that I could get the experience of feeling different sensations. And one of the things we're going to learn throughout the years, or throughout the semester rather, is that as you develop throughout the years, if you don't use it, you lose it when it comes to those synapses in your brain that develop your associations between different sensations. So when you're exposed to those sensations early on, you have a better likelihood of retaining them throughout the years because your brain is constantly using those connections. This is part of why children learn languages, not just the content of the languages, but the tonal qualities of speaking a different language much easier than adults, because they actually have a better ability to build these synapses early on. So, what's enrichment? Well, enrichment is exposing an individual to enriching experiences. So we see right here, we've got one rat in this miserable looking crate. He's alone. He has access to food and water, which is all he needs to survive, but he doesn't have the requirements to thrive. Over in this crate, you see that we've got a lot of rats. They've got their food and their water, but they also have access to ladders, they have access to ramps, and they have access to socialization. And what we see is when we sacrifice these rats, after, we inject them with something that will kill them, and we slice their brain. And we see that the rats that lived in the impoverished environment had very, very lower levels of synaptic growth, and they actually had significantly more pruning, which is something we're going to talk about in a moment. The rats in the enriched environment over here, these guys had thicker cortices, so they had a more developed brain, and this is in large part due to these enriching experiences. Now, we talked before about how animal research has its place and it has some real merit. So one of the things that's come out of this is that these experiments on enrichment have changed how we house animals. When you go to factory farms, those animals are miserable. But animals on family-owned farms often put play equipment out for their animals, and that play equipment makes for a happier, healthier, better animal. It's also changed the way that we treat children. We give children more access to better toys, in large part because we know that this changes their brain structure and gives them a leg up. It gives them a better opportunity to be healthier, happier, and more able to compete with their peers academically. Now, beyond just mental stimulation, I mentioned this just a few moments ago, it's important to provide tactile stimulation to your infant as well. So later on, we're going to talk about the orphan studies where they examined some cognitive and physical deficits of orphans that were not exposed to touch early on. And what we find is that physical stimulation aids in both mental and physical growth. It also helps develop bonding. So physical stimulation of an infant is very important. And in fact, what they found is that with preterm babies that are born prematurely, one of the best therapies to get them to continue on their development is actually massaging them and giving them exposure to physical stimulation. Because what we'll see, and we're going to talk about a homunculus in a couple of lectures, which is a visual map of the neural connections in your body and what has greater sensation. What you'll see is that things like your hands, those are something that you use a lot, and so there's actually a lot of neural connections so that you can then sense differences in temperature, pressure, different pain pathways, and this is evolutionarily beneficial. And so when you give people access to touch early on, it helps develop these connections, and it gives them a better opportunity of longer survival and a better opportunity of procreation. So these experiences that we have strengthen the neural connections. Lack of experience prunes away unused connections. So that's what I talked about earlier with this rat down here. He didn't have these experiences, and so his brain says, well, you know what? I don't want to waste glucose, which is my primary fuel source, on synapses and connections that aren't going to be necessary for my survival. And so it prunes away those connections. You know, your brain and your body, they don't give a damn about how smart you are. All they care about is that you survive long enough to procreate. So if it's not necessary, it's just wasting glucose resources. But if it becomes necessary for the environment to survive and thrive, then it's going to allocate those resources to maintaining those synapses. And so that's really very important. You want to give children access to as many opportunities as possible for them to develop their neurons. So that's where we say use it or lose it. So here's a perfect example right here. So in this study, they used, I believe that they were rhesus macaques, but I can't be sure. They had these monkeys, once again, I believe they were rhesus macaques, which is a very frequently used monkey in psychological research. And they trained them early on to tap a lever. And tapping that lever gave them access to food. So it was a reward experiment. So tap a lever, you get food. Sweet deal, right? Well, what they found was that this is the brain activation at the start of the experiment, where they were just learning, you know, lever equals food. This is it after a couple of months of use. And you can see this is synaptic growth. This is where we're seeing greater connections in this area of the brain associated with tapping the lever. So they're being rewarded, and as a result, they're strengthening the synapses in their brain. One of the things that I've read, I don't know where the source is, I'll look for it if you guys are interested, but I find it to be fascinating, was they did a study with young children in a school, where they went to the school and they explained to like 3rd or 4th graders how the brain works, specifically how these synaptic growths can occur and what that means for using experiences to build their mental ability. The simple act of telling these children how their brain worked resulted in higher scores on the SAT and higher graduation rates, because these children knew experience means that I will do better in the long run, and as a result, they focused more of their efforts on physical and mental experiences that would grow their ability to perform well in the academic and later on in the experiential world. So if you have kids, tell them how the brain works. It's going to help them out. And if you're a kid yourself, well, now you know. So one of the next steps, you know, beyond just exposure to a certain environment is how do your parents influence you? And everybody loves to blame parents for everything bad that happens with their kids, you know. I don't know how many times I've read in the news, parents, you know, when they find out that their kid has committed some heinous act, I don't know where I went wrong. And then, of course, you know, when your kid graduates as valedictorian, you know, I did really good. You know, I think a perfect example is something that happened with me. You know, my mom was raised by a man with Asperger's, and so she is deficient in many social ways. And so she's, you know, it's funny, we'll go to the grocery store together, and she never really speaks with the cashier. She's not rude to them. She just generally doesn't acknowledge them because it doesn't occur to her to do so. And so I was, you know, visiting her one day, and we were in the line at the grocery store, and you know, I spoke friendly with the cashier, and I thanked her as she was bagging my groceries, and I was generally friendly, and I said, "Thanks so much. I hope you have a wonderful day," as I was leaving. And my mom and I were walking out, and she said something that struck me as really funny. She said, "Wow, I must have really raised you right. That's not something that I think most people do. You were so kind to her." And all I could think was, you didn't do anything about that. That wasn't a parental influence. That was an experience that I had because I've worked in the service industry since the age of 14, and I know how frustrating it is to be treated like someone that doesn't matter. So parental influence is less strong than the media and social factors would have you believe. Parental influence is more genetic than anything else. If you want to blame your parents for anything, blame them for the genes that they gave you. You can't really blame them for your personality aside from the genetic components that they gave you, because there are far more factors that impact how you develop than that. So parents matter, but it's the genetic predisposition and the other social influence. The other thing that parents matter really heavily on is more to do with where they choose to live. So, I do apologize. I know that I do this too much, but I go back to my own experiences because it's what makes the most sense to me. So, when I was 7 years old, my parents decided to move, and we were moving to a relatively rough area. And my parents decided that they would rather live across the border into another state where they had a well-renowned school system and commute 45 minutes into work so that they could give us access to a better educational experience. As a result of that, I had a different set of peers and a different school system than I would have had they chosen to move in that other area. And as a result of that, I probably would have been a very different person. The environment that she got the job in was still going through desegregation processes. They were still doing academic buses to integrate black and white kids into a single school. I went to a school where that was no problem, and that's one of the other main parental influences. So again, parental influences are primarily twofold: genetic and the environment that they set you in. So another wonderful example is, it comes from a twin study. They had these two twins, and it's really a very funny anecdote. They had these two twins that were separated at birth, and they were both fastidiously clean. They were very focused on cleanliness in adulthood. So when asked, "Why are you so clean?" both of them had very different answers. The first one said, "Well, my mom kept a very clean house, and so I must have learned this behavior from her because no matter what, she always wanted everything to be clean. If it wasn't clean, she would yell at me. It got very frustrating. I focused on that." The other guy had a very different response. His response was, "Oh man, my mom was a slob, so I feel like it was a reaction against her sloppy behavior." So like I'm saying, a lot of this, it's really genetic predisposition for a lot of our behavioral and personality traits. Now, a lot of things, like I said, behavioral and personality, those things are largely set by genetics. There's a little bit of wiggle room for environmental experiences, but when it comes down to what's most malleable by your experiences, we're looking at things like attitudes and behaviors. And for this, once you get past about the age 5, peers have a greater influence than your parents do. And that's in large part because you're spending so much more time around your peers. But it's more than just that. Think about an evolutionary advantage for peer influence. They say peer pressure is a terrible thing. It makes you do bad things. Well, honestly, peer pressure isn't that bad, because what peer pressure does is it teaches you to interact with people your own age, and when you think about it, the people your own age are the people that you're more likely to mate with, have children with, and develop with. And so if that's the case, it's better to fit in with people your own age than to fit in with people of your parents' generation. Because if you fit in with people of your parents' generation, you're not going to be able to procreate as effectively. So again, the biggest parental influence is really just determining who your peers are. I mean, they might be able to prevent you from making friends with certain people, but mostly it's going to be about where they wind up having you live. So parent and peer influences really complement each other nicely. But they're not isolated. There's a really interesting interaction between parental and peer influences when you consider culture. So the next influence we're going to examine is cultural influences. So in some cultures, parents might have a greater impact on different characteristics, different attitudes and beliefs. In other cultures, it might be peers. So cultural influence really impacts a lot of your behaviors and values because culture comes down to behavioral, value-based traditions that are shared by a group. So think about it this way. We want to talk about the evolutionary advantage of having culture. This is one of the things that's enabled us to thrive as a species. Part of the reason why humanity is so successful is because we have culture. Now, there are tons of other species that are social, and possibly as social as humans, but they lack culture. Some primates have culture in rudimentary forms. They might use specific tools in general areas, different qualities with their communication, but what it all comes down to is language. Language enables culture. Without language, we have a diminished ability to develop culture because we can't communicate. And communication allows us to say, hey, this tool works really well for this issue. And because of that, we grow and develop. So think about the cultural changes that have happened within the past 5 years. Smartphones. Smartphones are a perfect example of something that without culture would have never developed, because we have conferences where people go and they discuss what they're going to do to make a better phone. And this would not happen if we didn't have culture. One of the other benefits of culture is that it allows for a division of labor, which again enables greater survival. So in our prehistoric past, we had very little level of division of labor. We had hunters and we had gatherers. Okay, we'll break it down essentially by gender. For the most part, men tended to be the hunters, women tended to be the gatherers. That's not a lot of division of labor. Today we have psychologists, biologists, chemists, software engineers, soldiers, presidents. You name it. We have an extreme division of labor. We have people that work in factories that build things for us. We have people that make clothing for us. This is huge. It's part of why we're able to do what we can do as a species, is because we have this division of labor. I don't have to worry about catching my own food because I can just go down to the store and get anything that I might need. As a result of that, the farmer, he doesn't have to worry about making his own clothes because he makes his money off of the food that he grows that goes on my table. And so each of us is able to focus on what makes us unique. As a result of that, we have less to worry about for our individual survival. So culture is incredible. One of the things that culture does do is it creates some conflicts when you get culture shock. So variations across culture is very real. So look at this picture of former President Bush holding hands in Arabia. That's unusual in the United States. Men don't typically hold hands, unless they're gay, in the United States. Little boys, absolutely, they often do hold hands, but it's something that's known as a norm. These are rules of expected behavior. Norms are valuable and they differ by culture, and that's part of why we have many cultural conflicts, because what's normal in one culture is entirely abnormal in another. Now, how might this sustain the survival of an individual culture? Well, this is one of the evolutionary reasons for xenophobia or racism or any other ism, is that if you have a culture that has your shared norms, you know what to expect. Knowing what to expect means that you know that you can be safe in this little group. If you find someone that does something that runs completely counter to what you expect, it's frightening. And as a result of that fear, you feel more likely to say, you know what? I don't think I can trust that person. They're too different. They might be dangerous. So we've got this discomfort that often has some advantages because, the advantage, of course, is increased survival, but it also gives us an identification. It gives us something that says, hey, I'm special, this is who I am. I'm an American, or I'm a Russian, or, I'm white, or I'm black, or I'm Indian. It gives us something that we identify with, and we actually take these norms in and they mean something to us. And so when we see someone that violates those norms, at a very basic part of our brain, it's hard to say, you know what, it's okay that you believe that way, because our brain doesn't want to say it's okay. We also have some variation over time that I want to mention. I mentioned smartphones before. That's a perfect example of variation over time. Culture and norms change as we age as a species. So, for example, 40 years ago, it was far more common to have a woman at home with the kids. That was it. That was far more common 40, 50 years ago. Now we have more women in the workplace. So these cultural traits by themselves are not set in stone. And that goes back to the need for us to be involved in peer influence. Because those norms change, if I held to the norms of my parents' age, that could be detrimental to my ability to procreate. So we see a lot of shift as a culture ages. Now, I mentioned just a few moments ago that we really like to hold on to what makes us unique. I'm a white girl from the southern United States. That's part of who I am. I don't sound like I'm from the South. I was born in Georgia, believe it or not. But it's part of who I am, and I really cling to that. It gives me a sense of community, knowing that that's where I come from. But being a female is also a really big part of who I am. Just like being male or female might be a really big part of who you are for you too. So gender also strongly impacts how we develop. I know that there's a lot of movement out there to say, gender neutral everything. Well, the fact of the matter is that gender differences exist. We don't need to perpetuate them. I'm not saying that we need to force boys and girls into any specific rule. I'm just saying that gender does exist, and it's very important to acknowledge that. So another example from my childhood that's rather frustrating. I grew up relatively tomboyish, and we're going to talk about some of the biological components of that in a second here. But I wanted to be a cheerleader when I was like 5 years old. I told my dad that. And he was very much in this idea of gender neutral. And so he actually looked at me and ran counter to what you would expect a good parent to say. And I love my dad, he's a great parent. But he said, no daughter of mine is going to be a cheerleader. And so I took gymnastics instead. I wanted to cheer. I didn't want to do gymnastics. I quit gymnastics after a couple of weeks. He was basically trying to force me into a mold that wasn't really who I was. Because when it comes down to it, my gender predisposed me to certain behavioral characteristics, but my society also pushed me in the direction of liking certain things. It's a very interesting interplay, once again, between genetics and environment. So, for the most part, men and women are the same. The majority of our chromosomes are not gender specific. There's only one chromosome that determines whether or not you're going to be male or female. And that's the second of the 23rd pair chromosomes. So a lot of the differences that we have come down to physical differences. So women have 70% more fat on average, 40% less muscle, and are about 5 inches shorter. They're more likely to become aroused quickly after having completed sex. They're more likely to express their emotion freely, and they're more likely to experience mood disorders like depression and anxiety. Men are more likely to experience color blindness, be diagnosed with autism, or antisocial personality disorder. So those are some of the differences that we see in men and women. Some strengths that we see in men and women, and this one really comes down to, we believe, some genetic predisposition. Women tend to be better at spatial localization, which means the ability to identify locations on a map and remember where they are, whereas men are better at spatial reasoning, which means being able to look at a map and figure out where to go or how to get in a certain way. And this comes down to, once again, some of our earliest roles, this earliest division of labor of hunter-gatherer. Hunters need to be more skilled at being able to track down something. That requires spatial reasoning. Women tended to be the ones that would go out and find food. And so they needed to remember the location of where they might find a good cache of nuts or berries or whatever it is that they're looking for. And so these traits have developed over time, and that's part of why that exists. But there's also an experiential component where boys are typically encouraged to play outside. They do a lot more war gaming and playing of that nature, whereas girls tend to be encouraged more to play inside and do house-type behaviors. So there's a strong genetic component, but there's also a strong environmental component as well. Men and women also differ quite extremely on measures of aggression, particularly physical aggression. Males are, generally speaking, far more physically aggressive than females. And this makes sense if you look back into our evolutionary past. Not only are men built with a higher muscle content, lower fat content, but they're also the ones that are going out there and doing a lot of the physical activities. They also have testosterone, which predisposes them to aggression. In addition, there's some some fighting over women. They want to get laid, they want to get the prime resource, they want to get the best looking women, so they might fight over her. The gap is much smaller, and in some studies have found inverse when it comes to things like verbal aggression, where there are some cases that have found that women are more verbally aggressive than men. And again, there are some evolutionary reasons why women might be more verbally aggressive, such as cattiness does exist, and again, that's sort of trying to secure resources. We're going to talk later on about some mating behaviors that are really interesting, like testing. There's some evolutionary evidence to suggest that a woman testing a man with stressors has an evolutionary advantage, because if she can test a man, then she's more likely to know, all right, he's going to stick around, all right, I can have babies with him and know he's not going to leave me because I've put him through hell. So it sounds awful, but it has an evolutionary component. So the next time you read that story that says don't put your dick in crazy, part of the reason why she's acting crazy might be because there's an evolutionary advantage to testing you. And if you don't want to put up with it, you might not procreate. But again, there are certainly stories on Reddit that are far excessive, far beyond what would be normal crazy. So let's talk a little bit about gender development. So like I said, it's all down to the final chromosome of the 23rd pair. So if you're XX, then you're female. If you're XY, then you're male. One of the fascinating things about this, though, is that because it requires that Y, which is very small, you can see right here that the Y chromosome is tiny in comparison to the X chromosome. Part of the reason why this is so interesting is that if something happens to the fetus in terms of gender development, it will default to a female. This is very important. What I'm saying here is that there can be women who are phenotypically female. You can look at them and have no reason to believe that they're anything but 100% woman, but they can be genetically male. That is very, very interesting. That doesn't happen the other way around because you need this Y chromosome to become male. So someone that's born genetically female with the XX, it has to have that XX, can never be born as a male. But someone that is genetically male can wind up being phenotypically female. We call this phenomenon default female. So around 7 weeks, your sexuality or your sex begins to develop. And this is in large part the result of different hormones. So these hormones are released. It's going to be androgens. There's going to be estrogens. These, the chemical components start this cyclical fashion where, more testosterone leads to greater testy development. The testy development leads to greater testosterone, and so it continues on and on. And oftentimes, the individuals that go to default female have what's known as androgen insensitivity syndrome. So these individuals are insensitive to the androgens that their body produces. As a result, they are born phenotypically female, and there's a wide gradation, wide variation of how phenotypically female they might be. And in fact, they often have, they're not, these women are often very beautiful. They're very tall, often, and much thinner than typical women. But they're very girly. They're not tomboys very often. They tend to be girly girls. The only reason why they might ever find out that they are, in fact, genetically male is once they hit puberty. So they're still going to develop breasts, wider hips, and more subcutaneous fat, but they're not going to have a period. And after a while, they're going to go to a gynecologist. And that gynecologist will determine that they are genetically male. One of the ways that they diagnose this is they find that these women have very shallow vaginas, which makes conventional sex uncomfortable. So they actually do an elongation of the vagina through a number of exercises. And this enables these women to live happy, wonderful, healthy lives. They can't procreate, but they're generally less, they're not any more likely to be gay. Some studies have found that they may be, but there's not a general consensus on that. They're just as likely to be gay as I am, and I'm straight, and many of these women are straight. Now, in the 4th and 5th months, all of these testosterone are really developing the genitalia. And so that's why we actually have to wait a while before we can determine whether or not a baby is going to be male or female. Now, in addition to, the androgen insensitivity, there can be some problems with, the mother's rejection of androgens, and there's some interesting interplay there. So basically, if the baby is not exposed to enough testosterone, it's going to default to female. Now, what about girls? What if they're exposed to excess testosterone? Well, excess testosterone for girls results in generally one of two things. They may be more likely to be lesbians, or in my case, I was probably exposed to greater levels of testosterone because I was a tomboy. I was very much a tomboy. My parents were pacifists, and boys typically play with toy guns and stuff like that, and I wasn't allowed to play with guns. So I had this giant candy cane, What did I do? I played with all the little boys on my street and I pretended it was a gun. That's in large part because I was exposed to almost exclusively boys. I was one of 2 girls on my street, but also because I was probably exposed to higher levels of testosterone in the womb than normal. And that's part of why girls develop into tomboys, is that they're exposed to higher levels of testosterone while they're in the womb. So not only does the estrogen and the androgens impact your physical development, but it also changes a lot of the structures of your brain. So we see that the hormones can impact, development in certain regions of the brain. You might be stronger in certain areas, which again come down to things like spatial localization or spatial reasoning. But in addition to the genetic components, there's a very social method of sexual development. And what we find is that these are what develop what are known as gender roles. So gender roles are the expectations of how men and women behave. These are the norms for your gender. And they change over time. They're absolutely malleable. But our gender roles are one of those things that, when violated, make people uncomfortable. They make people feel anxious. So it's beneficial because if we know what to expect of others, it reduces our anxiety. But when we run counter to those, we have some conflicts. So a perfect example is stay-at-home dads. That runs completely counter to the gender roles of 20 years ago. So what we find is that stay-at-home dads have more conflicts, typically, with their spouses related to, being a man or being seen as manly. That's less so for people of my generation because it changes over time. So I've got a friend, he's a stay-at-home dad, and him and his wife have an excellent relationship because for them it doesn't violate their gender roles of what they expect between how men and women are supposed to behave. So gender roles, once again, are very important. And one of the things that we look at is gender identity, which is how they view themselves in terms of gender. So there was a quote, I don't know how many of you subscribe to our atheism, but I go to our all the time. And one of the things that I saw recently on the Our Atheism page was, that quote from the Native American gentleman saying that they had the 2 souls explanation for individuals that were attracted to members of the opposite sex. That they had, more androgynous people held 2 souls within them, and that was a wonderful thing. Well, that 2-soul behavior, that androgynous behavior, is part of their gender identity. So I very much view myself as a woman. There are women out there that view themselves as a man. There are men out there that view themselves as men, and men out there that view themselves as women. And this is a completely separate area from homosexuality. There are women that view themselves as women but are attracted to women. So that's very different. What I'm talking about here is how you view yourself as a person in terms of your own gender. And that is heavily impacted by your experiences, but also by your genetic, your genetic makeup. So attitudes about gender roles vary over time and over cultures. And it's a really interesting field, and I'm hoping that as we develop as a species, we will continue to become more progressive in our attitudes about what makes a person male or what makes a person female. But chances are that we'll fluctuate as we have in the past, and we'll go back and forth between what's an appropriate gender role and what's not. That's just the nature of our species. We have to adapt to a changing environment. If we don't adapt, we die out. And so these roles and these norms will always be in flux. It will always change. Because if they don't, we struggle to survive. So that's it for today's lecture. I hope you guys enjoyed it. We're going to talk a lot next time about some really exciting materials. So I hope you guys come back, and feel free to come on over to the discussion thread and ask any questions. I'll be there to answer anything that you guys want to know. Thanks so much. Have a great day.